Hello, and welcome to our video presentation. Tori Valentine and myself, Michael Dye, will be explaining the history of Vietnamese refugees, along with the development of resettlement patterns throughout the United States. So to start out, here is a broad timeline of important events that contributed to Vietnamese resettlement. The Vietnam War began in 1955, which divided the country into North and South combatants. This war would later be the reason for hundreds of thousands of citizens to flee their homes in Vietnam. 10 years later, in 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act was signed under the Johnson administration. This act would limit restrictions on immigrants and refugees entering the United States. The first main catalyst for Vietnamese emigration and resettlement is the 1975 fall of Saigon, which ultimately ended the Vietnam War. Throughout the late 70s and 80s, there was a wave of Vietnamese refugees entering the U.S. and moving across different states. By the end of this wave, the 1988 Amerasian Homecoming Act further relaxed immigration policy in America, generating yet another wave of migration. The subsequent decade of the 1990s, followed up by the 21st century up through today, saw greater rates of Vietnamese integration within American society in several forms. To go into further detail on this timeline and historical context, I will now discuss immigration policy and the Vietnam War. On October 3rd of 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Immigration and Nationality Act into law. This act removed the quota system that favored predominantly white immigrants and refugees originating from Northern Europe and the British Isles. As a result, this act opened up the range of racial groups able to enter the U.S., Vietnamese Americans included. Towards the end of the Vietnam War, on April 30th, 1975, North Vietnam took over the southern city of Saigon and effectively the rest of the country. This new regime adopted an intense punitive policy on any and all southern Vietnamese citizens with ties to the United States and the former Republic of Vietnam. As a result, the main push factor causing Vietnamese citizens to leave their country was political persecution of the communist regime in North Vietnam. In direct response to the U.S. military withdrawal and the refugee crisis in southern Vietnam, President Gerald Ford signed the Indochina Migration and Refugee Act. Beginning in May of 1975, this act coordinated a massive evacuation and resettlement plan of citizens in Saigon to the United States.
Indochina primarily refers to a collection of Southeast Asian countries formerly colonized by France: Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. As such, Indochinese refugees consisted of not just the Vietnamese, but many others seeking asylum from various other crises in the territory. For the purpose of this presentation, we will be focusing on the Vietnamese refugees. Now, plans for evacuation actually began before the fall of Saigon, with the large-scale evacuation beginning in full from an airport within the city itself on April 23rd. Efforts prioritized the South Vietnamese citizens with backgrounds in higher education and anyone affiliated with the U.S. government. The evacuation process was later done via military helicopters on the roof of the American embassy after the airport closed on April 29th due to North Vietnamese rocket fire. Many Vietnamese citizens and other foreign nationals were left behind, and a large number of them fled by boat, earning them the name Boat People. Nearly 800,000 refugees managed to sail safely to another country. However, most of the boats used in this rushed escape were not built to withstand traversing the open ocean. This, on top of dangerous weather, overcrowding, starvation, and disease, made for a very high death toll among those out at sea. It is estimated that anywhere between 200 and 600,000 of these boat people died before ever reaching shore.
The subsequent migration wave took place from 1979 to 1988 and had two forms. One being the external entry into the United States from Vietnam, the other being the internal migration of Vietnamese refugees throughout the U.S. One reason for the external wave is the fact that bordering countries like Cambodia, China, and Laos had strict immigration policies at the time, in contrast to the U.S. The cause of the internal wave was the refugee dispersal policy implemented by the U.S. government. Under this policy, incoming refugees were to be relocated in a short span of time, and sponsors were needed to help facilitate migration throughout the country. Religious organizations coordinated with the U.S. government for the most part, including the United Hebrew Immigration and Assistance Service and the U.S. Catholic Conference. The main goal of this dispersal policy was to help Vietnamese refugees become economically self-sufficient and quickly integrate into American society. Migrating to different states from the origin point of California, along with the results of this policy, characterized the outlook of this subsequent wave. Looking at a map of the U.S. Census in 1990, we can see how a large number of Vietnamese Americans moved to coastal states like Texas, Louisiana, Virginia, and Washington. Another significant policy, the Amerasian Homecoming Act of 1988, came about by the end of this wave. In this act, foreign children of a Vietnamese mother and an American soldier father were now admitted as U.S. citizens. In the late 90s and early 2000s, Vietnamese Americans were recorded among the second fastest growing racial group in the U.S. Today, about 1.3 million Americans identify as Vietnamese. Analyzing the U.S. Census in 2020, there are now 7 states with more than 50,000 Vietnamese Americans. Pull factors that drew and continue to draw Vietnamese citizens to enter the U.S. include the policies that enabled more migration in the first place and economic opportunity.
Despite such a massive resettlement beginning in 1975 and so many Vietnamese refugees coming to America, their population does not break through the top 10 American immigrant populations until the 1990s, after which it remains one of the largest immigrant populations to this day, with a head count of over 1.3 million Vietnamese Americans as of 2022. Thus becoming the 4th largest Asian American group and ultimately making up approximately 3% of the United States' total immigrant population. The resettlement of citizens from Vietnam into other countries is considered the last global resettlement, with the United States taking on more refugees than any other country. However, other countries with a large community of Vietnamese diaspora include Japan, China, and Australia.
In the early period of resettlement, Vietnamese refugees faced many challenges to integrate within American society. The first notable factor that contributed to integration back then was social class. Higher skilled laborers and workers that made a higher wage in Vietnam found it easier to integrate. This reflects the nature of the 1965 Immigration Act, one of its statements favoring the entry of immigrants that can contribute to American economic growth. However, this group of upper-class Vietnamese settlers was extremely small. Many workers who once had higher-ranking positions in Vietnam now faced poverty in the United States. Middle to lower-class refugees suffered the most and constituted the majority of those entering the U.S. Social mobility was rigid for most Vietnamese refugees in the late 1970s, limiting the extent of economic integration. Overall, refugees found difficulty adapting to the American education system. The minority of the highly educated, those fluent in English, and more well-versed in American culture, more easily integrated in the classroom. Children also tended to retain information better and learn at a faster rate than their adult counterparts. Yet, the majority faced barriers in the realm of education. Since public schools neglected to teach much of the Asian American experience, students generated stereotypes against Vietnamese Americans, making them feel alienated. The close-minded narrative on Asian Americans in schools at the time severely weakened educational integration. According to Gallup polls made in 1975 and 1979, American public opinion shortly after the Vietnam War was, for the most part, not in favor of accepting refugees. Many Americans assumed that incoming refugees would take jobs and welfare spending would have to dramatically increase. The last and perhaps more interesting aspect of integration earlier on was the refugee dispersal policy. Despite the goal of easing the process of integration, several unintended consequences emerged from the policy, including family separation. In contrast to the late 70s and 1980s, Vietnamese integration in recent years has seen improvements. Today, Vietnamese Americans are now within the fastest growing racial group in the United States. They represent 3% of the total U.S. immigrant population and are projected to grow through the remainder of the 2020s. There are now more generations of Vietnamese families living together in the U.S. In terms of education, there have been some limited improvements to teaching the history of Vietnamese Americans. Most history textbooks that public schools use, such as the American Journey, still lack key records and documents like the migration wave of the 1980s and the Amerasian Homecoming Act. Urban and metropolitan areas have the highest levels of integration, since most Vietnamese Americans live in these parts of the country. Today, we can see this level of urban integration through ethnic enclaves. Throughout the U.S., there are multiple enclaves named Little Saigon, which reflect all kinds of aspects relating to Vietnamese culture. Some of the largest enclaves are in Orange County, California, Houston, Texas, Portland, Oregon, and Fairfax County, Virginia. By far, the largest Vietnamese enclave in the U.S. is the enclave of Saigon Town in Westminster City of Orange County. Around 189,000 Vietnamese Americans live there, making up 40% of the city of Westminster's population. Another large enclave is Vietnam Town in Houston, Texas. More than 38,000 of its citizens are Vietnamese. In Portland, Oregon, 2.3% of its population is Vietnamese. Fairfax County in northeastern Virginia has 9% of its population as Vietnamese. Each of these areas promote Vietnamese culture through their architecture, shopping centers, and restaurants.
Despite no longer existing as a state symbol after the fall of Saigon in 1975, the flag of the state of Vietnam and later South Vietnam is still used to this day by Vietnamese refugees and their descendants around the world, particularly in America and Australia. It has since been coined the Vietnamese Heritage and Freedom Flag. To say that it is the preferred flag of the Vietnamese American community is a major understatement, with many protesting any attempt by officials to represent them using the current national flag of Vietnam. This makes sense considering that the majority of Vietnamese refugees came from southern Vietnam. As a matter of fact, the Vietnamese American population as a whole tends to lean more Republican due to the anti-communist sentiment that carried over from the war. To this day, Vietnamese Americans have continued to assert themselves and demand recognition in their own right, removed from the image of the country they fled while holding on to their language and traditions. Even though they make up only a small portion of the United States immigrant population, Vietnamese remains the sixth most spoken language in the United States, with 1.5 million speakers across the country, and since 2002, the Vietnamese Heritage and Freedom Flag has been recognized as a symbol of the Vietnamese American community by the state governments of California, Colorado, Florida, Hawaii, Michigan, Missouri, Ohio, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Virginia, with similar recognition garnered in over 80 cities across 20 other states. While this has only been a brief summary of the events we touched on, we hope you found it informative and encourage anyone interested in this chapter of Vietnamese American history to go learn more about the details that we weren't able to fit into this short presentation. Thank you so much for watching.